now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. A lot of people in the comic book industry have a negative view of former Marvel Comics editor Jim Shooter. Now, a lot of these people have an issue with Jim Shooter. Some say that he was extremely abrasive as related to his approach to editorial, and others say that he was basically someone who they had major issues with as related to creative. However, when I look at Jim Shooter as an editor-in-chief, I can look at the results of his work, and as a result of his leadership, Marvel Comics became a dominant force from 1978 to 1987, when he was abruptly fired from his position, and Marvel Comics basically had a resurgence to the point where they were able to start generating those strong sales that would eventually lead to them becoming the dominant comic company in the 1980s. Now, Jim Shooter basically started out in comics under the leadership of DC's editor, I believe is Mort Wessinger, and was mentored in not only the craft of comics, but he was also mentored in the whole publishing business, and that gave him a major advantage as related to things, because having an understanding of not only the craft of comic storytelling, but also the overall publishing business made it where he was a prodigy who had an insight into the business and understood the underlying foundation that many comic editors never understand these days, which is that when it comes to comics, comics is a publishing business, and with it being a publishing business, it's all about sales. The ultimate goal of a publisher is to get sales, and this is something many comic editors these days just don't understand. They don't understand your ultimate goal is to not only generate sales, but also to continue building that momentum to keep those sales moving. And that's why Jim Shooter was very successful, because he had that foundation in understanding the publishing business, and having that understanding of the publishing business is something that made him one of the most successful editors as related to the business. Now, a lot of people get upset because they have personal issues with Jim Shooter, but I look at this man's results as related to comic publishing, and I've read his blog and read all through the things that he talked about as related to publishing, because he said that when he left DC after writing Legion of Superheroes to head over to Marvel, he started writing their flagship book, The Avengers, and I could see the impact of his work, because when I look at Jim Shooter's Avengers, it was a very tightly written book that basically dug deep into the lore and really gave us really compelling stories, really drew the reader in, and this was what you need to do in order to generate sales as related to creative, because when I look at the earlier books, like the Englehart ones, they are okay, but they just were not as tight. When I look at Shooter's Avengers, it's a tight book, and a tightly well-written book that basically each book flows into the next book, and that basically sells the next book. Moreover, when I look at Jim Shooter's overall books that he did with George Perez, again, that was a great team put together. I mean, George Perez was a rookie at the time, but he was both of them were very solid, and that got the flagship book strong. And you really want to get your flagship book strong, because that's the book that's going to lead the other books and generate the sales. So I saw where he was going with his marketing strategy, and that marketing strategy worked very well, because as he came on, we started to see more referencing of other books in books, and that referencing of books in captions basically incentivized young readers to go look for the other titles to find out what these characters were mentioning. Moreover, this created a more cohesive Marvel universe where you saw an entire world being built, and you had to collect all the books in order to get the world. So his whole approach basically created a lot of sales because the cross-referencing allowed people to go out here and not only go look for the other titles, but also start looking for the back issues. So I could see the impact of Jim Shooter's whole editorial approach, and that editorial approach was one that did a great job of generating sales. And as it generated sales, this basically led to a lot of books that were on the cusp of being canceled, like Daredevil and Iron Man in the 70s. A lot of people don't know that Daredevil and Iron Man were this close to being canceled due to poor sales and having weak creative. But when Jim Shooter came in, he put new creators on those books. He put David Michelinie, John Romita Jr., and Bob Layton on Iron Man, gave us that definitive run. And he put Frank Miller on Daredevil, gave us a definitive run, and just basically let those books, again, mid-list books, come up and rise. And this, along with the flagship books and other books, they basically, again, they all were synergized together. And as they synergized and created a more cohesive Marvel universe, this created more sales for Marvel and built up the brand. And as it built up the brand and people started seeing, oh, these books are now starting to sell and starting to sell in good numbers. We're starting to see a lot of the lower tier books starting to sell in better numbers. This is what, again, motivated a lot of companies to start looking at Marvel and taking it more seriously. Because what a lot of people don't know is that in the 1970s, the comic book industry, as related to the times, because it really wasn't a business like it was today. Again, we had the back issues starting to come up as related to demand, because before them, people just threw comics in the garbage. But when the comics are good, people start looking for the back issues. And when the comics are, again, doing well, people start thinking about things. Because, again, in the 70s, if it wasn't for licensing, Marvel and DC wouldn't really be in the place they are today. It was licensing that kept them afloat, but it was the storytelling, once it got better under Jim Shooter, they got Marvel competitive and got it competitive to the point where people started looking at Marvel a bit more seriously. And as it started to look at Marvel a bit more seriously, this is where we started to see animators like Ruby Spears, I believe, come in and do the Spider-Man and Amazing Friends show and the Incredible Hulk show. And we started to see merchandising start to emerge, because with Jim Shooter, he was the driving force behind Secret Wars. Now, a lot of people may think that, oh, Secret Wars was a bit corny, but the Secret Wars was designed to be an entry point to people as related to Marvel characters, and again, open the door for the Marvel to grow and expand, allow it to grow and expand as a business, because many Gen Xers were starting to discover Marvel characters. And one of the reasons why they were discovering Marvel's characters was due to Jim Shooter's editorial and his tight focus. I mean, his storytelling as related to things, he made sure that all the stories in the Marvel Universe were cohesive together, and that you saw that larger world, and you could access that world through any comic. Because one of the things he pointed out on his blog that I actually apply as an approach to storytelling is making sure that every story is an entry point, and every story is somebody's first, so the story needs to be one that anybody can access. And that was one of the things that he did in comics that basically had a major impact on sales, in addition to, again, creating that more cohesive and expanded Marvel universe. He basically, again, made it where these books where every story was an entry point, and he also further focused on more as related to sales with merchandising and licensing by creating comics as related to the Star Comics line. The Star Comics line, a lot of people look at that line and say, oh, that line is so corny and it's for kids. But this is all about sales again. And if you want to go out here and get revenue, you need those type of comics, those licensed comics, because that's bringing revenue into your business, is bringing money into your business. And he was smart enough to say, okay, I'm going to do the Star Wars comic. I'm going to do the licensed Star comics. Again, these are revenue streams. But if you look at modern Marvel, they're not focused on those revenue streams because most of the people who come into comics today do not understand the publishing business the way Jim Shooter understood the publishing business. And because he understood the publishing business and understood one of the tenets, which is 9 out of 10 books fail, so you got to make the ones that sell fantastic and make them spectacular. He understood, okay, you got 9 out of 10 of these books I'm going to launch are going to fail. So I got to make sure that the ones that can sell strongly. This is something he understood, even though he had some failures like New Universe. The whole thing is he understood, you don't cancel all your Marvel books to do New Universe. You do New Universe as a side, but you have other things like the Star line coming in, bringing revenue. So he understood the business of revenue streams and understood, okay, licensed comics, they're going to make the revenue as related to getting licensing fees, and they pay for those comics. And again, that's going to meet the standard of the sponsors. Then I'm going to have the main Marvel Universe. That's going to be a revenue stream coming in. Then I'm going to have possibly this new universe, these exploratory concepts, and basically going to put a little money on this. So he understood also about budgeting and how to, again, budget a company. This is something that I do every day with SJS Direct, is I understand I have to budget things as related to projects. I have to be able to allocate money for certain projects, and I have to have resources for those projects, and I have to have a whole plan for those projects to basically be on a road to costing out. And you have to understand how the business of publishing works to understand Jim Shooter's approaches. And a lot of people in comics, they're mostly focused on creative, so they don't really understand why he did certain things or why he was so hard as related to editorial. No, they don't understand this because they're not in the chair of a publisher or an editor-in-chief, because the editor-in-chief's job is basically to be the objective eyes and ears of the customer. That's the job of the editor-in-chief, to relay what the readers are going to say about these characters. And sometimes the creators, when they pitch concepts, they get upset and they go, "Oh, you're telling me not to do something." Well, as the editor-in-chief, I have to look out for the business. I have to look out for the brand. I have to look out for the whole situation later on, because you might want to do something, but it could do damage to a character. It could do damage to a character's story. It could do damage to a character story model, and that may upset some people. It may upset some people creatively, but you have to do what is in the best interest of the brand, and that's a very tough thing to do, is tell people, okay, you can't do this, and try to explain it to them, because some people may have ideas, oh, I may want to do this, but the whole thing is that there's ramifications to that it may wind up alienating readers. And again, if you don't have a good editor to sit down and talk to you and explain to you, hey, don't do that story, hey, that's going to damage this character, hey, the story's not, the reasons and motivations are not going to fit into the overall universe, or it may just have a domino effect as related to damage. That's what a seasoned publisher is going to sit down and talk to you about. And a lot of people may have gotten upset about that. They might have said, oh, this guy is so mean, but the whole thing is, what really would be rougher is having to deal with the business going out of business due to a bad decision. Have the business go out of business due to a bad decision. And that's what a lot of comic pros weren't really thinking about as related to things. And eventually they got Jim Shooter out of Marvel in 1987. And sadly, that's where I started to look at Marvel comics, and I started buying comics in 87. But I could see where we had a pattern of decline of Marvel as related to editorial, because as Tom DeFalco took over, yes, he did a lot of great comics, but the overall quality of Marvel really started to fall off in the 90s, as related to the quality of the storytelling, because the editors there were not thinking about maintaining that cohesive universe or making tight, well-crafted stories that flowed from one book to the other, or making those easy entry points. Again, without Jim Shooter's vision and understanding of the business, Marvel Comics did go in a state of decline creatively, and we got some really terrible stories as related to certain characters like Iron Man and that horrible Dragon Seed saga, which basically, again, threw the character off until Len Kamenetsky was able to get the character back on track. And we got other stories like the Clone Saga, which basically was just a complete mess because editorial let it go too long. Not to mention, we had lots of other books like Captain America, which went a little too long as related to Mark Gruenwald's run. I mean, they didn't have that tight focus as related to storytelling, and as the 90s went on, Marvel suffered seriously without Jim Shooter. Meanwhile, he went to Valiant, and Valiant was competitive until he left, and then when he went out here and started Defiant Comics, it was a strong company until Marvel sued him, and sadly, the industry didn't see the impact of having a good editor who understood the publishing business, because comics will break your heart, and because comics don't appreciate talented people. Again, they don't appreciate having a strong boss to, again, run the entire publishing house. And when you're running a publishing house, you need to be very strong and assertive. That's something I've learned from my experience working with different artists and working on my own stories. I've learned, and working with other authors like Lawrence Cherry, I've had to learn, again, there are a lot of hard decisions. There's a lot of rough things as related to this business, and a lot of people don't understand things about things costing out. They don't understand things about sales overall. There's a whole side of publishing that people don't understand in comics, and that's why comics is struggling right now, because we get people who don't have that publishing background who understand this business, because people who understand this business is one where you can basically go out from taking huge losses on having the wrong books out there. You can take big losses from derailing a book with the wrong story. I mean, when you don't have a seasoned hand that understands this business, what happens is your sales are going to suffer. And again, in a sales business, sales are everything, and your job is to generate sales. That is your job as a publisher, is to generate sales. Your job is to sell lots of books. And a lot of creators, they want to just think, oh, I get to create the stories that I like. I get to create. No, this is a commercial business. And your job is to sell what the customer wants. Your job is to sell what the customer wants to see. Your job is to give the customer exactly what they want. But sadly, what's happened in comics is that there is no Jim Shooter to basically regulate many of the creatives and get them on the same page for sales. No, what a lot of creatives want to do is go out here and do stories, and because the publishers are inexperienced or the editors are inexperienced, like in the case of Dan Didio, I will give you a prime example of how Dan Didio destroyed DC, because he came in from Hollywood, he had no publishing experience, and he didn't understand that publishing is sales, and he allowed the creative team to go out here and do the Event Identity Crisis, and the Event Identity Crisis basically compromised the character of the DC Universe, compromised the ethics of the characters of the DC Universe, and that basically started putting the DC brand into a tailspin when you have a story that features a character being raped by a supervillain, and then the heroes erasing the memories of everyone so that they won't remember that happened. Again, DC's characters were paragons of good, and this creator basically had an idea. Oh, I'll do this story. And again, this was where editorial snatches you and says, no, we're not going to do this story because it's going to do damage to our brand. But Dan Didio basically wanted to do this story because he thought it would shock readers. But the whole shocking thing is it took the DC brand into a tailspin. took the DC brand into a tailspin because editorial did not pull this guy's chain, and it's up to editorial to pull chains because you start to have, when creators get out of control, yeah, they may have these ideas, but the whole thing is you have to explain to them, how does that fit into our brand? Again, if I'm an editor-in-chief at DC and somebody comes to me and says, oh, Sue Dibney is basically going to be great by Dr. Light, and then what we're going to do is have Zatanna erase memories and make it like it never happened, I'm going to point to them and say, DC is a family brand. We sell to families and children, and this is not an appropriate story for our brand. And this type of story, again, you want to do that you can do that in Watchmen. That's a separate universe. You can do that in Vertigo. But with DC's characters, they need to be family friendly, and this book needs to be PG. And if you're pitching this kind of story, I gotta say, you know what? I'm not gonna pick that story. That story's going in the trash. And it's not. And if you pitch this type of thing, I'm not even considering hiring you because I'm going to look at you with a side eye. Again, that's what editorial's job is to do. But sadly, we don't have editorial at comics, basically reining in the crazy creatives, reining in the crazy so that we can make commercial products that are family friendly. And while people want to sit there and say, oh, Jim Shooter was abrasive, Jim Shooter was hard, again, this business is hard, and you are basically 1 month away from going broke, and that's what we've seen with the comic book industry since the 90s. I mean, Marvel basically went bankrupt due to its own distribution and the complete fall off due to the bad stories that its new editorial were pushing as related to their books. And things got progressively worse when Joe Quesada took over Marvel. Again, another man who knew comics but didn't understand publishing. And again, understanding publishing is something that the comic book industry doesn't get, that Jim Shooter did get. And that's why Jim was able to get success wherever he went as related to editorial, because he understands how rough this business is. He understands how hard this business is, and understands that, again, this is a sales business, and you need to be making product that sells to the customer. You need to be making product that gets the customer's attention. You need to be making action and adventure that is all ages family friendly. That's how he had great success and was able to make Marvel one of the big brands of the 1980s and the dominant comic brand of the 80s. I mean, if you look at the way he expanded Marvel with the way he did the Star line, the way he did things as related to those licensed products, did things as related to expanding Marvel's overall brand, and even going out here and again giving us things like those new and improved guys like the Silver Centurion and the Black Spider-Man costume. I mean, this was, again, founded, and the whole thing with the Secret Wars, again, giving you an understanding of how to do business overall. But people will say that this guy is terrible. But the thing is, I look at his whole business approach, and again, if you go to any other trade publishing house, you're going to find out how rough it is. Again, they want to sell books, they want to market books, they want stuff that they can sell to the largest audience, because according to statistics, 10 years ago, there were 5 million books being published every year, and in that marketplace you have to stand out and compete. And what a lot of people don't understand in comics is, yeah, people know who Spider-Man is and Captain America is, but the whole thing is, if you don't create a competitive product, you're going to be just another face in the comic book store. And this is where a lot of comic pros miss out on things. They don't understand that this is a competitive business, and you have to stand out on the rack of the comic shop or stand out online, that you really need a good editor to give you that guidance to make your product stand out, to help you get your book competitive, to get your book competitive to the point where that book can go out here and be able to sell by getting people's attention with the cover. And when people look in the interior, they can get excited about it to the point where they want to buy that book. And this is where people underestimate, again, the value of a Jim Shooter in the editorial department. Here was a guy who, again, learned the business, learned the craft of comics, but also learned the business of publishing. And That's why I cannot go out here and talk bad about Jim Shooter. I may have not worked under him, but I can see where his approaches have worked because I've used his approaches as related to entry points on the ISIS, Esteem, and John Haynes books. And I've seen the dividends pay off from people when they can just go pick up one of those books like ISIS, Esteem, or John Haynes and go back for the back issues or go forward to get the next book. I've seen people pick up the entire run of the ISIS series, about 6 or 7 books back in about 2014. People pick up the entire run of Esteem books, and even people pick up back issues of John Haynes and even books in the Spinsterella trilogy. So I know that his approaches to comics work in the trade publishing world. I know that people can follow the order of those books. I've seen people pick up books like Isis the Beauty Myth, which is the 3rd book in the Isis series. I've seen people pick up Revenge of the Cyber Goddess and go back. I've seen people pick up the book John Haynes, The Man with Nothing to Lose, and go back to the other John Haynes books and even pick up The Temptation of John Haynes. I've seen people pick up Spinsterella and go back all the way to Spellbound. So I know that Shooter's approaches work, and I understand he comes from that background of publishing that we really needed in comics. We really needed that publishing professional who understands this business, and understands how to do business in this business. Because, again, with Jim Shooter, people were getting paid. They were not getting paid as related to these Marvel at one time. You had people working and not getting paid, but people were not only getting paid, but getting their art. Again, another approach I learned from Shooter is, again, learning to pay your people on time. That's a sign of respect, is paying your people on time, and because they've got bills. And I always try to make a point to make sure that people are paid, and that's not something that's being done in comics today. But again, when I look at the legacy of Jim Shooter, I don't see a guy who I can hate as related to his business, because his business took care of business to create the environment of the boom period of the late 80s and the 90s that people basically squandered. And had he stayed in position at Marvel, maybe that golden age could have lasted longer than it actually did. Now, my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available on Lulu.com right now. And if you want to pick up a paper copy of John Haynes at Death's Door, you can find that comic on Lulu for the same price as the 2022 Kickstarter. And if you want to check out my first digital comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle for 99 cents. And if you want to check out all the action-packed fantasy fiction on the SJS Direct imprint, you can find all of the books in the SJS Direct universe, such as the Isis series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy. You can find all those books on Amazon.com. in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Draft to Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. And if you'd like to see me make more videos talking about the comic book industry or publishing in general, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.